Welcome, and this is a session now focusing on trade and monopoly and oligopoly. So many of you guys have kind of raised a few general conceptual issues. So I thought that this particular lecture will focus a little bit more on the rationale for trade, and we'll talk a little bit about monopoly and why we're kind of discussing it. And then finally, we'll be talking a little bit about oligopoly. So just as a gentle reminder, by the time you've seen this video or when it's uploaded, you should have already uploaded all of your short answer questions. So hopefully this shouldn't come to you as a nasty surprise. So let's talk a little bit about trade. I guess the first question which most of you will have is, well, why do we actually need trade? And I think we kind of briefly touched on this in the first chapter, where hopefully you somewhat kind of recall that there were basically gains to trade. That is, when we opened up an economy, remember that the CPC actually could and should effectively expand your consumption possibilities for that particular economy. So now we're kind of going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk a little bit about, well, what are the things the governments can do, sometimes out of good intentions, but actually end up to be fairly negative and have obviously unintended consequences. So the first thing is, well, let's talk a little bit about trade. Okay, so as you know, when we talk about trade, we typically mean, more generally, trade obviously just, trading between two people. But for this particular course, we're really thinking about, well, trade to other economies. Okay, and when we're thinking about trade to other economies, you're going to say, well, why should I actually do that? And the answer is simple: because there are gains to be had from actually trading with other economies. And let me kind of demonstrate that fairly simply. Okay, so hopefully you guys should recall that you have this diagram, this equilibrium diagram, P and Q, and you have your typical S and D curve. Okay, so as you all know from previous chapters, that if we left the economy to do its own thing, this will be the equilibrium quantity. This will then be the equilibrium price. So then what would happen if we were allowed to trade? And let's say that the price was different to what is the equilibrium price in the domestic economy. Well, there are obviously two scenarios. The first possibility is actually the world price is below the equilibrium price faced by this domestic economy. So if that were the case, as you'd probably know, what this suggests is that you're going to have excess demand, right? Suppliers are only willing to supply this, right? The domestic consumers demand this quantity, and hence this represents your excess demand. But remember now that we're actually trading. So in fact, right, all these consumers out here can now import the difference, isn't it? So this is where we talk about imports. Okay, and you guys say, well, how does that actually leave me better off in this economy? Well, think about it a little bit more carefully. Okay, the first thing to note is that if we were here, okay, our consumer surplus is obviously given by this. Okay, and your producer surplus would be given by this. Okay, so hopefully you guys know how to calculate this stuff. But then what happens when the price drops? Well, now remember, all of these additional people are now able to actually consume this good, isn't it? Furthermore, for all of these other consumers, they now face a lower price. So effectively, this area here all becomes consumer surplus. So it's effectively expanded, hasn't it? So we now have all of this as consumer surplus. So we basically transferred some of the producer's surplus to consumer surplus, and hopefully you can see why now trade is contentious. But more importantly, you can see this part here as the additional surplus that has been created as a result of trade. So if we walk through another example, right, let's consider this scenario. Okay, so we have S and D, okay. And let's say, again, this is your equilibrium price, Q of E and P of E. Okay, so this is your P and Q. So let's say now that the world price is out here. Okay. So again, if we kind of looked at this in the domestic economy, we would have excess supply, isn't it? So again, because we can trade, we can actually now export this quantity out to the foreigners, isn't it? So what effectively we're saying is that, well, again, who will actually benefit from this? Well, let's do a bit of analysis, right? Originally, as we know, this is your consumer surplus, which we've kind of highlighted before. This is your producer surplus. Okay. So then now, look at what's happened. Now, this is the price faced by everyone. That is the world price. So what happens? Well, producers, right, feel that they can now get a better price, right? So this is the new price that everyone faces. So actually, domestic consumers will only demand this. So that's fine. But what effectively happens is, well, everything here also now pretty much gets transferred from from consumers to producers. Okay, so producer surplus is now this giant triangle here, and consumer surplus is just now that small triangle. So again, we have this expansion of the actual economic surplus, isn't it? And that's given by this area here. So again, hopefully you can kind of see why we want to trade, right? Of course, it's always contentious because the actual allocation of the surplus will always change, and hence, as a result, consumers or producers will be unhappy. But hopefully you can see from this particular diagram, it's fairly clear that overall, the benefits to the economy should actually be positive. And hence why economists tend to advocate for free trade. So let's then move on to the next thing. And that is really more talking about, well, what are the things the government can do? And this kind of stems from the same chapter, from the previous chapter where we talked a little bit about government intervention. So effectively, there are two tools that the government can actually implement to control trade. Okay, the first that we talk about in this course is what we call a tariff. Okay, a tariff is basically a per unit tax on imports. That's basically what a tariff is. Okay. So think about it as basically anything that comes in, we basically are going to charge you an extra 10% or 10 cents per unit. That's basically what it is. Okay. So that's one way that the government can actually control trade, right? And they could say, well, we want to protect our industry. And that's usually a classic argument that they use. The second way that we do discuss in this course is what we call a quota. And that is a quantity restriction on imports. Okay, so basically what the government is saying in this particular scenario is the maximum that you can actually import is, let's say, 2,000 units, and that's it. Okay, so let's kind of do a bit of a analysis as to what actually happens once we actually move from this world where we basically have free trade, and when the government attempts to basically implement each of these policies. So let's start off with the tariff, because I think most of you, once you get the tariff, the quota should be a little bit, should come across a little bit more intuitively. So I'm going to use the green one now, okay? Just to make this a little bit more exciting, okay? So a tariff. So we have a tariff, okay? And we have, as per usual, a supply curve and a demand curve, P, Q, okay? And let's say that initially the world price is here, okay? So we call that PW, okay? And as you can immediately see, right, based on this, okay, that's basically the quantity that we would then import. That's the excess demand, because our producers are only willing to produce this much, okay? Now, let's say that the government has basically said that we're going to whack on a tariff. So, in fact, the world price will then go up here, and this is PW plus T, where this amount is simply T. Okay, so let's think about what's effectively happened here. The first thing to notice is the reduction in consumer surplus. Okay, because think about what's happened. Well, the price has effectively gone up. So what would you expect to happen? If prices go up, the quantity demanded is always going to come down, isn't it? So more precisely, consumer surplus has gone from this big triangle to this small triangle. So immediately, hopefully you can immediately see from that, that's actually a bad thing, okay? But then let's see how we may be able to recover some of this lost consumer surplus, okay? The first thing to note is that when the price actually increases, think about what happens to producers. When the price increases, they are more willing to supply more units, okay? So unsurprisingly, okay, producer surplus goes up by this much, because obviously, relative to this price, the domestic quantity supplied basically goes up to here. Okay, so that's the first thing to note. So the next thing then becomes, well, okay, how about everything else? This is still a loss though, right? Isn't it? You're going to say to me, that whole thing here, this trapezium, is still a loss. Maybe. Let's not jump so quickly to that conclusion, okay? And of course, now as you can see, the quantity demanded is now back here, okay? So this, again, you can immediately see is also a deadweight loss, okay? But then, how about tariff? Well, think about who actually gets the tariff. It's imposed by the government, right? So any amount that's been imported is subject to a per unit tariff. So this is the quantity that's been imported. This height here is the value. So all of this basically represents tariff revenue. So what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with a deadweight loss here and another deadweight loss here, okay? So hopefully you can then see what's basically happening. So part of it, the lost consumer surplus, part of it is going to be recovered by producers, domestic producers producing more, because of the higher price, they have a great incentive to supply more. Part of it is being recovered from the tariff revenue that's been generated from the imports. However, in net, we still are faced with losses. So these things here are still deadweight losses. Okay, so that's the first thing to note. And you're going to say to me, well, what does this actually represent though? Well, hopefully, right, it should be fairly clear that this one should be just basically lost consumer surplus, right? So this is a consumer loss in the sense that previously, consumers that were consuming are no longer consuming as a result of the higher price. Okay, so that kind of represents the net consumer loss. How about this though? This is what we call producer loss. Because of the higher price, the price has been somewhat artificially inflated. That's what basically forces them to actually produce more, or more precise, not forces them, but rather that induces them to produce more. But in reality, if we were to consider the world price, right, what would happen is that a lot of these producers wouldn't actually be producing. And in fact, this you could kind of think of as a cost to the economy. It's an inefficiency in some ways, right? Because they wouldn't necessarily be producing, but they are because of the tariff, right? So it's an additional cost, which could have been, these firms may have been doing something else that would have been better, right? So that's what these things represent, the producer loss and consumer loss. So now let's think a little bit more about a quota, okay? And you've probably seen this diagram and you're going to say, well, it kind of looks the same. And I definitely wouldn't disagree. It definitely does look very similar, but the logic is somewhat a little bit more different, okay? So what would happen? So let's go on to this, okay? And we have S and D. So we have the same diagram. And as you can probably, and as per usual, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the world price is down here. Okay, so that's the world price. Okay, and now we effectively have to think about how we represent a quota. So there's a couple of things. In higher level trade courses, we do represent it in a slightly different way, but the way that we represent a quota is effectively saying that it kind of adds to domestic production. Okay, so this is why you get this shift. It's not really a shift per se on the supply curve. It's kind of adding to it. So one could argue that, well, the fact that you're shifting the supply curve across supply suggests that you've actually got a lower marginal cost, and that's not actually true. But it is one way that that's one of the ways that we represent it to kind of simplify the assumption. Okay, so this is what we call Q-U-O-T-A, S plus quota. So let's say this is the quota, and that is basically 2,000 units. Just for simplicity. So in other words, in this economy, okay, you'll be restricting yourself to simply just 2,000 units. And you're going to say, well, cool, but what's happened? And again, looks slightly messy, but logic through it, and it should hopefully make more sense. This is the world price. Now let's think a little bit about, well, what would actually happen when we impose this quota? What would actually be the price that the domestic consumers face? Well, it's the point where supply meets demand, isn't it? Okay, so this is obviously going to be the price of quota. Okay, and hopefully you can immediately now see where the similarities are. Okay, this is actually now going to be the price faced by the domestic consumers when they could have faced this particular price, isn't it? So from that, you can do a very similar analysis, right? So previously, as per usual, you would have consumer surplus as this, but now it's now shrunk to this. Okay. So then what's happened to producer surplus? Well, as you would expect, because they face a higher price now domestically, they have a greater incentive to produce. So producer surplus gets transferred from consumer surplus by this amount. Okay. So then you're going to say, well, okay, cool. So where are the deadweight losses? And hopefully, if you've gone through the textbook, you would immediately see that's actually the same area, which is this and this. Okay, so this and this. Okay, and then you can say, well, but we still have this. What's this? And that's the gain to those that hold the import quota. Okay, so obviously you would have seen that in one of the questions when I was dealing with quotas, I asked what is the gains to the government. Obviously, this is not necessarily the gain to the government. Okay, so there are a number of arguments that you can make to say that it is, but directly speaking, this is not the gain to the government. This belongs to the import quota holders gain. Because effectively, think about what the import quota holder does. They're going to purchase the good at this price and sell it domestically at this price, aren't they? So that's effectively what they're basically doing, and hence this represents their gain. Who does it belong to? It can belong to private citizens. You could argue, like I said, that yes, companies might actually make this gain, but they may be extracted by the government because the government can always sell these quotas to them. Hence, ultimately, it may be the government that actually receives this. So a typical question is then asked, well, okay, how would the government determine which is the better policy? Well, hopefully you can immediately see that actually they're both not great policies, right? Which is why the World Trade Organization has been working really hard to try and lower tariffs and trade barriers more precisely. Because as you can see, it's basically stopping you from receiving the full benefits of trade. But you can also immediately see why the World Trade Organization is also running into a lot of problems, because you're effectively, right, in some cases, you're actually giving producer surplus to your domestic economy at the expense of consumers. So obviously, right, producers in some ways in this particular model have an incentive to lobby the government to actually not lower trade barriers, right? And this comes back to this problem here, right? We know that trade is good, but the allocation of it is what's always contentious. And as a result, right, it's always going to be a major issue in economics. And again, this is an area which I do study, and I've written and I have a couple of working papers on it, and I find it fascinating. But for those that want to explore more into this, always happy to talk more, but we'll probably leave it there for now. And and hopefully you've learned a little bit more about trade. So let's then move on to monopoly and oligopoly in the next two sections.